I was trying to think ahead of time about what links all the topics here. It's titled Emerging Issues in Energy and Environment, I guess, and our emerging policy issues in energy and environment. It's not up there.
Emerging energy and environmental policy issues.
Yeah, I knew emerging and policy and environment and energy were all in the title. And I think what, it's not like all the topics that have been discussed today have had some policy issue tied to them. I think everybody is kind of motivated by something that's going on, whether it's climate change or regulation or gas prices and policies surrounding those things. But I think what makes this panel a little bit interesting is each of the folks who are going to speak is thinking about an issue that I think is I would define as emerging. It's something that represents changes that are going on and are affecting the way policymakers need to deal with a particular issue. And so we have federal action on climate change, state regulation, and the Clean Air Act, and oil and gas drilling in the Arctic. So what I had asked all of the folks on the panel to do, just to try to give it a little bit of consistency across speakers, was to answer 4 questions, or to think about 4 questions. Maybe they won't actually answer them. One is, what is the underlying policy question that's being asked by the project? And in particular, what are the events or trends that are pointing to its importance going forward? How is the project going to answer the question? What, if any, insights have arisen so far? And also, are there opportunities for other folks to get engaged? Because what I'd like to do after we finish, in addition to having questions for the panel and their research, is to try to have a broader discussion of events and trends that point to important policy issues at this energy environment nexus. So with that, I guess we'll just go in the order that is up there. So I will turn to Tim first.
Great, and thank you, Billy. Thank you, Richard and David, for this day. Actually, I think it's been a great day, and I have the microphone and the ability to say it, so I will. I am going to talk about the Nicholas Institute's work on the application of the Clean Air Act to greenhouse gases, and so Jonas and I have arranged that he will then look at the state and utility regulation. Part of the reason for that is we looked at these titles and said, if I'm not talking about the Clean Air Act, I'm going to have a very short presentation when it comes to federal action to address climate change, particularly greenhouse gas mitigation. So first, to try and take Billy's questions, why is the Nicholas Institute and our colleagues around the university interested on this question, the regulation of greenhouse gases by the Clean Air Act, particularly with a focus on existing sources of greenhouse gas pollution? Well, we've been working on this issue probably since 2008, and we began to work on this issue really because of the failure of the greenhouse gas legislative effort that Lincoln referred to, the cap and trade bill that was moving in 2009 to 2010 through the Congress and then failed in the Senate in 2010. And when that legislation failed, coupled with the 2007 ruling by the Supreme Court that really cleared the way for the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases, it became clear that really the next step was for EPA to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. To give it a little more context, that the legislative effort from 2000 to 2009 was aimed very much at the creation of a greenhouse gas market. It was widely believed in the policy circles that's how this country would address climate change. And whether greenhouse gases were a pollutant to be regulated in the Clean Air Act was really thought to be sort of a bargaining chip in the legislative negotiations. The NRDC and others had brought lawsuit to get it authorized to be regulated in the Clean Air Act, but everybody thought in the end that would be a bargaining chip, and we get the comprehensive legislation and they take away that authority. Everybody was sort of left holding this authority in 2009, 2010 when the legislation failed, and you realize that now EPA actually had to regulate under the Act. And the other thing that was clear at this moment in time, that there had actually been very little thought given to how to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. And that's, again, why we thought was really a key issue to be looked at. So our work has been first at sort of explicating the authority, figuring out what is the right authorities to use to regulate under the Clean Air Act, and engaging stakeholders to sort of acquire their perceptions of it, and then looking at the challenges that face the agency in the execution of that act. First, the legal hooks for regulating under the Act. Again, in 2007, the Supreme Court did not rule that EPA had to regulate greenhouse gases. It regulated, but it paved the way, and the decision really would make it very hard for the agency to have found anything else. The Supreme Court ruled that greenhouse gases appear to be endangering the public health and welfare of the Act, and if EPA does make that decision, then is required to regulate. And so EPA spent 2 years evaluating whether greenhouse gases endanger the public health and welfare of the Act, which is the term under the statute, and that includes adverse effects on people's health, but also adverse effects on the climate and the weather. And based on the scientific findings, the EPA concluded in 2009 that greenhouse gases were a pollutant that were required to be regulated under the Act because they endangered the public health and welfare. Then they immediately turned around and regulated that pollutant for cars, for mobile sources in 2010, which triggered the requirement to regulate under the stationary sources, to regulate the power plants on the horizon. And in just last April, they have proposed a new source performance standard for that Act, which means for all utility plants to be built, it will have to meet a performance standard of under the Clean Air Act of I think it's 1,000 tons per kilowatt hour. Is that the pounds? Yes, 1,000 pounds of CO2 per kilowatt hour. That is a standard that's equivalent to a new combined cycle natural gas plant. So currently, EPA has regulated proposed to regulate greenhouse gases such that a coal plant, which would have a higher emissions rate, without any carbon capture equipment, would not be able to be permitted in the United States. EPA was very tricky politically in how they put that forward. They said, yes, we are doing this, but every model that Lincoln and Valley and others tell us are there tells us we will never build another coal plant, so this is actually just status quo. So that's the context, but when they regulated the new power plants, what they have done is they have triggered the need to regulate the existing fleet of power plants, and that's really becomes the most interesting questions. That's where the tons are, and that's where the most controversy is. And so the Institute has focused very much on how to regulate those existing plants. In regulating those plants, the agency has turned to a provision of the Act. I will say it once. I'll try not to quote statutory provisions. Section 111D. And that has rarely been used to regulate pollution in the United States. Under the Clean Air Act, you either call a pollutant a criteria pollutant, a pollutant that we generally want to regulate, and create a standard for what should be in the air in that pollutant and ask every state to regulate it. That's called a NAAQS program. Or you call it a hazardous air pollutant, a toxin like mercury or heavy metals, and you have very specific plant-by-plant regulation. Section 111, this provision only is triggered if you don't regulate under either of those other two provisions. And because the EPA can't call CO2 a toxin, and they don't want to create a standard for concentrations in the air because it will beget a panoply of regulations, they're trying to regulate it under Section 111 of the Act that has, again, only been used 4 or 5 times, has very little history. And in having that sort of virgin ground legally to try to find, EPA has a lot of opportunity, and that's what we've been working with, is to embed a lot of flexibility into how they use this provision. The Section 111 will require EPA to create a guideline of pollution, a standard for the states of what they think the state can achieve using a term, the best system of emissions reduction. And again, this term has rarely been used, so what does a best system of emissions reduction mean is subject to a lot of debate. Historically, people think that's a system, it's a technology, it's a widget you can put on your stack to control. But in the mid-2000s, the Bush administration tried to say that's a regulatory system, and you can use a cap-and-trade system for mercury, in this case, to regulate under Section 111. So there's some precedent that you could build all sorts of flexible systems to regulate CO2 from these power plants under Section 111. And the other thing that Section 111 does is it uses the principles of cooperative federalism. It empowers the states to do the programs. The EPA will only create a guideline for the states, And then the states will have to come up with a plan that will meet that emissions guideline from the EPA. Again, there's a lot of appeal to that for sort of principles of what they call cooperative federalism, because we can use those states as laboratories and say, well, maybe Ohio will come up with something better than Florida came up with. You also allow those states to have some heterogeneity of their appreciation of their challenge. So Ohio may have a different challenge than Florida. And it would provide an ability for those states that have moved already, like California, have already regulated greenhouse gases, to try and embed what they've already done and nest it into the regulatory system. So that was our sort of appreciation, our first step of the process of what is the best option for regulating greenhouse gases in the Act, and EPA does appear to be moving forward with that. In fact, it has a consent decree with litigants to do so. The second questions we're trying to develop now are what are EPA's options for the flexibility on the program, and what are the most important flexible options to pursue? Questions that we are looking at right now are what it would take to deem a state program like California's equivalent to what EPA would require? Can you use energy efficiency programs in the greenhouse gas program for your state? Can multiple states have joint programs? While there is a beauty to having a laboratory innovation, but the efficiencies of markets would be better if you cross over states and pool them together. And then what are the most important of the considerations to put in these rules for economic efficiency? So moving forward, we have multiple projects going on. We have a project to reach out to many of the states that have been silent on this, the coal and heavy manufacturing states, to try and work with them on what would work for them. Billy and Jonas and I are all working on a project with a number of stakeholders to model out what are the best ways forward on the Act, what are the most important flexibility mechanisms for EPA to offer to the states. And then at this point, the agency is only working with utilities. The first sector it has chosen to regulate is the utilities. It will then move on to refining and then move on to steel. And what are the unique aspects of those sectors of the economy that would either counsel us to use the same sort of program we would use for the utilities or a different sort of program? That project is actually sort of behind the utilities, but also what we're going to work on in Bass Connections and bring the students together to help us appreciate the unique aspects of those sectors and the legal bounds for state plans for those two sectors as well.